I think when you look at Oklahoma post Lincoln Riley, with what Brent has been able to do over the first couple of years, I think there's a certain degree of pleasure in terms of what he's been able to accomplish. First year it was eh, a little iffy, but I think there was a lot of understanding of what Lincoln left them with, and what he had to work with. And I think this last year was more of what they expected, right? 10-2, had an opportunity, a couple of things go differently, have an opportunity to play for a Big 12 championship, have an opportunity to maybe get back into the playoffs. But 10-2 regular season, 10-3 overall was more of what they're looking for. So to your point, when you marry this all together, the expectations are there. The expectations are high, particularly as you continue to recruit at a higher level at all positions. Then that expectation is going to be there. I think there's certain degrees of understanding of what the SEC brings versus what the Big 12 brings, but you know, kid you not, the expectation is still going to be there to win championships, to play for championships, and put yourself in a position to be in the playoffs. And I think the one thing that's going to be interesting, um, Mark, to see as you go forward is what's the expectations for these big time programs as it relates to the 12 team playoff. Like if you're Oklahoma, do you expect is every 5 years, do you expect to be in the playoffs 3 out of those 5 years? Is it 4 out of 5? I think probably if you're Georgia right now, you're Georgia, you're Alabama, you're Ohio State, um, I would say Michigan, but that might be a little bit of a different situation with the coaching staff and where they're at and stuff like that. But those typical blue bloods. I think they have the expectation of, well, there's 12 teams. We've got to be in that playoff every single year. But what's a team like Oklahoma that's really kind of that's trying to get back up to where they were under Bob, and even under Lincoln to a certain degree. What's that expectation? Because the expectation is always going to be there to compete for championships, but with 12 teams, how often is realistic, and how often you're able to um, make that playoff?
It's interesting that you frame it that way because I can hear the proud Oklahoma fans saying, and I totally get it, that Oklahoma doesn't have to take a back seat to anyone. So, despite not necessarily pulling through with national championships, this team has dominated its conference more so than any team in the country and has played in the top five basically for the last close to 25 years. Has just been sitting in the top five almost all the time. And if not, they've been in the back half of the top 10. So why should we take a back seat to anybody? But of course, Brent Venables, as you mentioned, took over a depleted situation from Lincoln Riley. He's building the program back up and building it in a different way. They are going into an SEC that is loaded, which, depending on how the playoff committee views that, it may be to their detriment because even though the SEC is going to be given more latitude, is it going to be able to overcome these killer schedules? Probably not. It's still probably going to be a situation where best record wins out unless there's an argument for a team that's got the same record, of course, out of the SEC, or even a one game worse record. So, yeah, everything you say right there makes total sense. Yes, at the three schools that you mentioned, for the foreseeable future, a missed playoff season is just going to seem like a complete disaster. Uh,
Yeah, yeah, no,
Ohio State, Luke Fickle was there in between Jim Tressel and Urban Meyer, so they had a down year in 2011. But I've ran the numbers on all these schools, and Ohio State would have last, other than that Luke Fickle year, would have last missed a 12-team playoff in 2004. They'd be running on a 20-year run of never missing the playoffs.
Mhm.
So, yeah, that is going to be, yeah, it is strange when you put it that way. I would think that for Oklahoma, it would be reasonable that in 5 years, yeah, they make the playoffs 3 times. One of the 2 times that they miss, they were like in it until maybe the last game of the season and they were that close. And then
Right.
maybe one down year, meaning 7-5 out of a 5 year period. I would think that that would be a realistic expectation.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard to it's hard to the way those schools have it rolling right now. It's hard to envision a season, at least right now, where where they don't even make, that they're not even part of that top 12. Even you know, even if they're in the lower half of that. But I think one of the things that I thought was interesting listening to Josh Pate a couple of days ago talked about, what's the ho we don't really have any idea at this point, on how the committee's gonna view some of these teams as it relates to 12 teams, right? Specifically, I mean, the point that you made was the point that he made, which is very valid. Are you indeed what your record says you are? Or is there do you get a do some of these teams get a little bit of a pass? Like if you got just for instance, we're talking about Oklahoma. If you've got a 9-3 Oklahoma team at the end of the regular season that has losses to, let's say you've got losses to Alabama, LSU, and let's just say Auburn for instance, those three teams. How does that rank up against maybe a group of 5 team that's 11-1, or maybe I don't know, maybe a team that doesn't have some of the notoriety is like from a big blood perspective. You've got TCU, for example, that's 11-1, is not viewed as tough of a conference, the Big 12, as the SEC going into it. So how do they value those teams? That'll be very interesting. And then what do they do with the conference championship losers? Some of those teams that are, maybe a team that was 10-2 going into the conference championship game, and they're in that 7-8 range. What do they do with those teams? So I don't know. It's going to be very intriguing to watch and see how that in the first season of how that looks.
Yeah, I may have mentioned on here during one of our playoff expansion discussions that if you run the numbers in the 12 team model of what's happened the last 10 years, your 10-2 teams always make it, your 9-3 teams almost never make it. It's a very clear cut, but there are a few 9-3 teams that would have made it. But to your last point about the conference championship game losers, it's pretty much an almost certainty based on how they have been evaluated that they were 10-2. If they were 10-2 going into the conference championship game, they were in the playoff. They were safely in the 11 that would make it, and that the conference championship game loss knocked them out of the playoff. Now, we don't know if the committee is going to handle those situations the same. Before, they were just simply ranking teams with no ramifications involved of being scrutinized if you ranked a team 11 instead of 14 versus now it means something. So they
Mhm.
might treat that differently.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But that's the most, I mean, that's the most intriguing part of this, is just to see how some of these teams are valued. So it'll be exciting to watch for sure.